So, welcome everybody to today's In Conversation with Dr. Anisha Abraham. Uh, Anisha is a pediatrician and she's the author of a newly published book called Raising Global Teens. It was published a couple of months ago, so she has finished writing the book, published the book, and launched the book during a pandemic. But more than that, she's also relocated from Amsterdam to Washington, D.C. with her family. So she's had an incredibly busy time in a very trying time for the rest of us. But I'm delighted that she's here today. She's done some amazing work and really has worked so hard on marketing her book. And so today she's here to talk about launching and marketing a book during a global pandemic. So welcome, Anisha. It's lovely to have you here.
Thank you, Jo.
So could you start off by just introducing yourself and telling everybody who you are?
Well, I'm a pediatrician and I'm a teen health specialist, and I have lived in a number of different countries and communities. I'm currently based in Washington, D.C., and I'm a professor at Georgetown University Hospital here. But prior to that, lived in Amsterdam, Netherlands, and before that in Hong Kong. So have lived and worked in many different places.
Do you actually have a teenager of your own?
Oh, yes, and I'm a parent of two boys. I have two lovely boys that are 10 and 12 years of age. And certainly a lot of my book has also been informed by not only being a pediatrician, but also a parent of kids that are cross-cultural and have lived in different communities.
Thank you. So tell us a bit about your book.
Well, Raising Global Teens is a book about all of the big issues that young people are dealing with today. I certainly talk about the hot topics like stress and sexual health, depression, all of the things that I know when I'm seeing young people that they're really concerned about. But I've written it through the lens of that cross-cultural, multicultural perspective. And I think that the world more and more is becoming a globalized world, a world where a young person is interacting with more than one culture on a daily basis. And as a result, there are more kids like my own that have moved from community to community, have parents that are immigrants, parents from different backgrounds. And as a result, there's, again, some differences, some wonderful strengths that they have, but also some challenges. So I've written this book, again, to help other families that are also going through a similar experience.
Thank you. You've written it because it's a very important topic, but people tend to write books for a variety of reasons. They maybe write it because they want to make money. Maybe they want to increase their reputation. Maybe they want to become an authority on the subject. What were your reasons behind writing it?
Well, I have to say it was more serendipity. I certainly truly am passionate about working with cross-cultural kids. It's something that really drives me, is to get the message out about how we can support kids, how we can improve communication and conversations. And I think that's an important part of why I wrote this book. But more than that, I had done a TEDx several years ago, and someone approached me and said, this would be a really good idea for a book. And I said, I'm a physician, I don't write books. And they said, this may be something to think about. And as it turned out, my time in Netherlands was a wonderful opportunity for me to actually start writing. And as we'll talk about later, I joined a writing group. And that was actually a very formative time for me to start thinking about this journey and how to put all of this together.
I would like to say that your TEDx talk was excellent. And before I met you for the first time, I watched it and I was most impressed. So what can you remind people what the topic is of your talk so that people can go and find you easily on the TEDx site?
My TEDx talk was demystifying teens and understanding teens and communicating with them. But it certainly was, again, an important segue for me to start thinking about this topic in a much more specific way. And as I said, really just launched the book idea.
And this is something that's not on the script that I sent you, but I'm intrigued with this because a lot of people, they want to write a book, but they don't know where to start. And I sometimes say, if you've done a talk, that's a fantastic way to start outlining what it is that you're going to write about. Did your talk lead towards the book? Did you find that the two were linked in some way?
Well, I do agree that something like a TEDx or a talk, which helps you to really put together all of your ideas into one, can be a good launching point. I certainly think my book was much more comprehensive in the end, and there was lots of other topics. But I do think the concept of working with young people, helping parents to think about young people, was something that came out of that talk, and again was a driving force. So I would agree with you. I think that if you are doing any type of talk or lecture and there's something that's really important that you want to get out in terms of a message, that can be, again, the start of your book process.
Yeah, I've found it can be extremely helpful because some people say they don't know how to plan a book, but they can plan a talk. Well,
Right.
actually, they're pretty similar. So nobody has worked harder than you, Anisha, at every aspect of writing, editing, publishing, and promoting. Tell us a little about what you put in place at the very start of the process. I know you had a focus group and you reached out to lots of experts, but can you tell us a little bit about all the village that you have got around you to help raise this book?
Well, I'm a firm believer as a pediatrician that we need to use our global village as parents and use that particularly if you're cross-cultural, because it's so important to, again, reach out for support. And I think I took that same mantra when it came to writing a book. I mean, that was the only way that I knew to get this out. I am not naturally a writer. I write, scientific research studies, but that's not the same as writing a book that goes out to the public. And so for me, it was very important to get input, particularly since this was a parenting book, and I wanted to make sure that the message resonated. So each of the chapters in my book actually start with questions that kids ask me, and then also questions that parents ask me, and of course ends with those questions. So in terms of actually developing this book, I used a lot of information that I had gained over the years from kids that I had been working with. And I used focus groups, as you mentioned, to help me to make sure that those questions were important ones, that they were the most kind of common and relevant ones. So I used focus groups of teenagers in different parts of the world, and also focus groups of parents. In addition to that, focus groups of my peers that were also physicians doing adolescent health, to make sure that what I was talking about was current and that I was encapsulating all of the information that was there. And as I alluded to, even prior to that, I joined a writing group. And I would say for folks that are really trying to get some structure, they need some feedback, joining a writing group is really helpful. And I don't think I would have gotten this far in that journey had I not had this wonderful group that I was meeting probably every 2 weeks to talk about, how to do the book writing process, to get feedback. So if you can't join a writing group, then certainly have a friend or a peer that's going through that process. But to me, that was really, really helpful to be accountable and to actually produce information. And then, as we talked about, the focus groups over time were also very important to make sure that this information really was relevant.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you had the writing group and you had the focus group, but I run a writer's circle, and it's not the environment for people to come as individuals with their book projects. So the writer's circle that you joined was a specific sort where presumably you were all working on books and took it in turns for one of you to be in the hot seat, so to speak, for a week, and everybody would read your manuscripts. Is that how it worked?
Absolutely. So we took turns with each writer presenting what they were doing, and then certainly giving very specific feedback. And I have to say, I give a lot of credit to my writing group, because I think that their feedback was very incisive, sometimes hard to hear. And I think it's important sometimes to get that critical feedback early on. This is just not working. You're not using your passion. It's not coming through. You're not using the description that you need to. Sometimes we don't get that feedback early on, and we kind of continue on in that writing process. So again, having that sounding board, I was actually the only nonfiction writer in a group of fiction writers. So it also helped me to learn a lot about things like science, fiction and other ways of writing. I learned a lot about the process. But I think having that feedback is really useful.
How many months or years were you in that writers group?
Probably 3 to 4 years. And again, initially it was more of an idea and then an outline. And over time, started to really put together a table of contents and think about the title and think about what was truly kind of the heart of my message. So all of this takes time. I'm sure others could probably do this in a much shorter time if they were really focused. But of course, I was also working, I was a parent, I was traveling. So there were other things were also happening during that period.
Goodness, I mean, I think people think that it perhaps they could organize a book in 6 months, but you have taken a long time, taken it very seriously. I'm also really interested to talk about how the focus groups manifested. So presumably you had these people all over the world and you liaised with them by email. How did they actually take place? I think it's a brilliant idea to do that and shows how incredibly serious you were about what you were doing. But I'm intrigued. How exactly did they work?
Well, it's a good question. And I think some of it was organic. I didn't set out when I was first writing the book to suddenly then use these focus groups. But I did realize as I was going through the book journey that I needed people that were also potential readers to give me feedback and again, make sure that what I was writing again resounded and seemed relevant to them. So I chose friends in different parts of the world. My book is really written for my girlfriends to a certain extent. Come and ask me for information. So I gave it back to, again, friends that I knew as an expat, certainly as a physician that, again, had these similar life experiences to ask them really how they felt. And I will say that you will ask a group of people and only so many of them will have time. So you sometimes realize that you have to ask quite a few people to be able to get that focus group. But I am very grateful to those that actually were able to dedicate their time to read several chapters, sometimes the entire book, and also sometimes in a very short timeline because you're really trying to get this feedback to keep moving on. So I don't have a specific answer as to how I developed it other than I tapped into folks that I knew would have the time, have the inclination, were interested, knew that they would get back to me in a period of time, and kind of built that in different communities around the world to make sure that it was really global.
So you must have bought a lot of bunches of flowers at the end of this process to thank all these people.
I'm grateful to a lot of people out there, and I did send a lot of copies of my books afterwards to those that have really been helpful.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent idea, and I don't know many people who have done that and been quite so dedicated. So well done. It's a fantastic idea. How long has each part of the process taken? So we've got the let's call it the planning process, the writing process, the editing process, and the publishing bit takes sometimes 3 months, sometimes more, and then the promoting at the end. So let's take them one at a time. So the planning, before you really started and perhaps got in touch with me, which was more at the beginning of the process. How much time did you spend on thinking about it and planning?
Well, I suspect all of this takes longer than we think. I probably had the idea that I should write a book for a long time, but certainly having that idea and then taking it to the next step and actually executing it also took, some period. And I think I had the idea for several months, and then I was very lucky to have been introduced to this writing group, which allowed me to kind of move forward in terms of developing this and starting to put something into paper. And that allowed me to then reach out to you with a chapter, a table of contents, with some ideas that were a little bit more concrete. And I think we met each other probably 2 years before the book, really came out. And then we worked together very intensively for at least a year. And I know for me, it was very important to have very specific deadlines. And I would probably say that a lot of people that are also working, and I was still teaching, I was traveling, I was doing a lot of work as a consultant, still have my responsibilities as a parent. So a lot of working individuals probably need those deadlines, and those were really helpful to me to make sure that I delivered content. So again, the writing process very intensely for another year, and no one prepares you for the fact that you need to do a lot of marketing. You're not done when you write a book. And in fact, you need to put a lot of time into making sure that this book actually goes out into the universe and that it's received. And I had some glimmers of that from talking to fellow authors certainly other members of the FIGT community, Families in Global Transition, were really, really helpful in terms of giving me some sense of that. But I just want to emphasize that as you're doing all of this, and particularly when you're writing, you need to also be thinking about how you're going to get this message out. My focus groups, for example, were a really important network for me to tap into when I did need to get that book out. And so creating that community is really important. And we'll talk about this more, but I also had a newsletter. I created a website. I was more active on social media with just information about teens and global health as a way to start to cultivate that community that over time I would market this book to. And I would say that this book was published in October, and I probably started very intensively talking to others and marketing this several months before and probably several months after. So, and you never really end. I hope you never really end. But I think building in, enough time for all of these things is really important.
Yes, I think that a lot of people don't realize that they need to think about the marketing before the book comes out. And you did all the right things with your newsletter and blogging and the social media and getting your brand sorted out. And I think from my memory, you started that more than a year before it came out, and you started to build up your database. And then what you also said there about using your focus groups and then tapping into them, the more people you've got in your support team, your cheerleaders, if you will, the more people who can then say, well, I know there's a magazine for parents in my town, because your focus group will naturally have been global. So you will have these people who are already on your side who will just be able to say, I think there's a school newsletter here. I think there's a club newsletter here. I think there's a parenting newsletter there. And they then help with the promotion as well. So they are phenomenally helpful. So I think that was very interesting. So yes, the writing we wrote together for, I think it was about 15 months that we were working that closely. And it really was, I think I probably spoke to you at least once every 2 weeks, maybe similar, something like that. And I know that it was absolutely constant as we polished one chapter and moved to the next. And then you get to the end and you go back to the beginning again and you go through it again. And then you were reaching out to your focus groups and getting more feedback. And it just went on and on and on. And you did it very, very seriously. So well done. So we're talking really about maybe 3 years from start to finish. Which is more than a lot of people think it takes, but the book you've produced is really worth it. So well done. And you did all this while you were working as well.
Yes, I did. And I think that it was really the sheer fact that I knew I had a deadline. I knew that I was going to be moving from the Netherlands at some point, and I really wanted to make sure that this book came out. I would highly encourage potential authors to really think about putting some kind of firm deadline. Otherwise, I think this process could just have continued on for much longer. And give yourself some time, but realize that if you can have a concrete deadline, that really puts things done when you need to.
Yeah. What was the hardest part of the process, do you think?
The hardest part. Oh gosh, many parts. At the end, I think I refer to this as having yet another child. This was my Dutch baby. This was my third child. I really did feel like this was a child that had been in gestation for a long time. There's many parts that were challenging for me, and I'll just say that I didn't come from this as being an author and a writer. And I think a lot of us had to get over this hurdle of not feeling entirely confident. I know my writing group was very instrumental in saying, you have this wonderful passion and what you're talking about can be translated. You need to, believe in yourself. And I think a lot of us suffer from self-doubt when we're writing it. So maybe that was the first hardest part. I know that when I'm talking to my patients and I'm very effective, I wasn't so sure that and so, constantly being able to feel very confident about that, I think is really important. Other hard parts, I think, are just making deadlines. And As I mentioned, some are much more disciplined than I. I've met other authors that get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and they write several pages every day. That isn't exactly how I lived. And I would simply write when I knew that I had a deadline. I had to get it out. And I think I sometimes laughingly told you that this writing happened in really crazy places. An emergency room when my husband had, hurt his wrist and we were on a ski vacation, and there I am busily trying to finish, my deadline, or, with some child at a soccer match or any of these things. Wherever I could go and get the writing done, I tried to take those opportunities. But, making deadlines and getting things done, I think, was also challenging.
No, that's interesting. You were talking about getting over your lack of confidence, and as a writer to start with, I remember very clearly, and I think it was nearly a year after we started working, that suddenly the penny dropped for you, and suddenly you said, "I've got my writer's voice," because it takes time to write your way into finding your voice. So to start initially, you will take baby steps and you will be a bit clumsy and it takes time. And then I remember so clearly you said this, I think we both said together, "This is it, I've done it."
Right. And just one point to that, I will just say that for anyone that's writing, you need to also think about what you to write in the first place. And for me, it was very much that this was going to enable me to get out the larger message about how we can help young people to thrive today. And that this was really a vehicle for me to continue to talk and to work in communities, to use that as a mission. Other authors come in because they simply want to, have a top seller, and they just, want to, have that book be very successful. But I think you really need to think about what is it that drives you to write this book. And again, use that to also convey a lot of your messaging. My second point would be, for me, again, not someone that was a natural writer and hadn't written a book before, I started writing regular blogs through my newsletter and writing pieces about failure and challenge and different things that I thought were really important for parents to be thinking about. And that helped me, as you mentioned, Joe, to create that voice, to start to come my authentic writing voice, which I can do much more naturally speaking, but wasn't able to always translate that into writing. So using those blogs that I had been doing for at least a year before I really put this all together was helpful. And in fact, I took some of those blogs, incorporated that into some of my chapters. It became very important. So I'd encourage others, if you are thinking about writing, to perhaps again have some form of a blog or regular writing that you're doing for a larger audience. First, you're creating an audience, but secondly, you're starting to create that voice that you can use and use that material for the book.
Yeah, I think it's an important point that it's about the voice as well as everything else. So yes, thank you for that. So some authors get their book out and then they go to sleep. You most certainly haven't. You have worked so hard, and you sent me a document of all the things you've been doing for your promotion, and it's 10 pages long. I don't know if you'd counted, but there are 10 pages. And on each page, you've probably got 15 different publications that you have done something for, or websites you've appeared on, or whatever. You have worked so hard. So can you just share some of the different genres, like you've appeared on blogs, you've had articles in magazines, some of the different genres that you've used to get the word out there about your book?
Well, I'll just mention for me, speaking to the community was very important. So this was something that I had done even before the book, but I certainly tapped into it even more as I was writing, because I knew that having those connections and getting this information out was really important for eventually being able to connect the book to this audience. So I did connect to groups that I'd already spoken to, for example, schools, but certainly global magazines, local groups. For example, I was in Amsterdam, so Amsterdam Mamas was something that I would write to quite frequently. Again, just to get information out. Ariana Huffington's Thrive Global, Medium, various forms where I could get blogs out, and then of course then repost it to LinkedIn and to other places. So there were a lot of different places that I reached out to. to, again, do talks, to do interviews, to do podcasts, because I felt that once you cultivate all of this, then it's very helpful then when you finally get the book out to come back and to also talk about your book. And we'll talk a little bit more about COVID. And, you know, as horrible as COVID has been, it actually in some ways created this opportunity for me to also talk a lot about how to support kids during COVID, and for me then to come back to all of these groups later when the book did actually come out.
Yes, so on that point, if you're trying to promote anything from a PR angle, you need to have a hook and,
Right.
and a timely hook.
Right.
And right now, COVID is in the news and it's right up at the top there. So if anybody can produce anything that is connected to what matters right now with their own book, then that is going to help them to get the column inches. So for you as a pediatrician, you could talk about COVID. For others, maybe we've got loneliness, we've got depression, we've got distant families and being alone at Christmas. There are all lots of other things that are very topical right now. So in a way, I can see that it's been a gift, unfortunately, in some ways, but it has, which has been really played into your hands, which is excellent. What has happened about book launches? Because normally people do book launches in the flesh. They go into a bookstore or they go into a school and they stand in front of an audience. You've done lots of global book launches. So how have they taken place?
Well, let me just say that this book was intended to come out in the spring of 2020. And again, if you recall the timeline for COVID, that's exactly when it really, I think, took center stage around the world. And I realized, I remember talking to you and thinking, this is not going to work. We're not going to be able to do this, because I had all of these launches set up in various parts of the world. And I was planning to travel to Hong Kong. I was planning to travel to the United States. I remember thinking, oh, this is not going to work. You know, we're not even able to travel. And also people are not going to be reading right now. We're really focused on what's happening with the pandemic. So I did really have to take a step back. And I'm going to say that probably other authors will, when they realize that this wonderful timeline, all of these events they've set up may actually not work. And I decided to postpone the launch of my book and to actually take some time to regroup, to rethink it, to add more information about pandemic and uncertainty and challenge, and then how that can affect young people into the content of the book as well. And I use the opportunity to, again, reach out to lots of individuals that were interested in talking about COVID and kids and uncertainty. So I think a good message in general for any author is you need to know what's happening around you at the time, because your book is going to be pitched based on what's occurring in time. And again, a lot of my publicity has really been specific to mental health issues, for example, and uncertainty, not just the book, because this is one of the messages in the book, but it's more about what is occurring and how this can be relevant.
But just to go back to my question about the book launches, how do you do an online book launch?
Yes. So coming back to your question, I had planned to do launches physically in different communities. Planned all of this, and as a result of COVID, I realized I would not be able to travel. And I think that many of us have found that doing events virtually is really what we need to do. So very quickly found myself doing Zoom talks on a variety of issues and doing webinars. And that over time, when it came for my book to come out, led to doing launches in communities. And that's where I tapped back into my focus group that I'd had in different places and literally asked different friends, colleagues, folks that I knew were quite important in communities to help to be hosts of virtual launches. And in some ways, it's a little easier to pull together a virtual launch than to get people together physically. So I was able to do quite a few of these virtual launches. In fact, I've just finished my 16th launch, which was yesterday in New York City. But I've done launches in several places in the United States, but also Germany, the Netherlands, UK, Hong Kong, and so on. And I think that I, over time, had hosts in those communities. They put out to their network and invited others to join this virtual chat. Over time, I created a little bit of a script in terms of having a Q&A and some discussion and talking points to make it a little bit more standardized and easy for everyone, and then opening it up to Q&A. And I thought that was a little bit more natural than just giving a talk. So I think everyone can do it differently, but again, coming back to your point, the beauty now of doing things virtually is it allows you to talk about your book to a lot more groups and a lot more people.
So that's excellent, because doing an online book launch, some people might think, well, how do I do that? I can't physically sell the book. I can't physically sign a book. You can read an extract from the book. So did you have links there for them to be able to go straight to Amazon to buy your book? Is that what you did? And people were buying there and then?
Well, I think that you create a buzz with the virtual launch. And so with each virtual launch, probably a week or two or even earlier, there would be messages going out to this network in that community about the book and why this was relevant and why this was important, and of course, how to buy the book, and encouraging people, of course, to attend the event to get more information about strategies and tips to how to work with other people. So people were drawn because they were getting information. And of course, one of the side things that you would continue to recommend is, if you want more information, please go back to this book. So I think that was the way that I did it. And I would certainly say that there's a lot of very creative ways now that you can do these virtual launches. As I mentioned, I decided that doing a Q&A with a moderator and then opening it up to Q&A from the general group at the end seemed to work pretty well for me. And also then having someone moderate the chat site and putting in questions, and at some point also giving information about how to contact me and how to get the book. So there's all these things that you can now do to get people thinking about it. And I've now been working with other magazines and groups that are really savvy about getting that information out, doing live Instagram and Facebook chats and whatever else, where that message about the book goes out into even broader audiences.
Wow. What a lot. What a lot you've been doing.
I've learned a lot, I have to tell you.
That's excellent. So now everybody's going to want to know, how did you manage to get on CNN?
It's a good question. I will say that I've always enjoyed media, and many years ago, I was also on CNN. So having some history of doing media work, I think, is really important. And even prior to getting onto CNN, I had been doing other media events, for example, NPR affiliates, local TV affiliates, and so on. I will also add that for me, I felt like I only had one shot with this book. So I decided that having a publicity team was really helpful. And the publicity team that I brought on board, Nardi Media, was very effective in terms of getting this information and pitching me to some of the bigger networks. So I certainly suggest for those that are interested and have the ability to do it, to work with a publicity team, because it does allow you to get out to those media contacts in a very time-efficient way.
So what did you say the name of that company was? Did you say it was Nardine?
It was Nardi, N-A-R-D-I Media. They're based in the United States.
N-A-R-D-I. I'll put that in the chat.
Nardi Media. But I will just say that even deciding to use a publicist was a big decision for me. And in fact, I had to interview other authors, ask them who they used. I interviewed a series of publicists in different communities, some in Europe, some in the US. Eventually, I decided to work with the team that was based in the US because that's where I was going to be. So I hope that other authors will use this information to realize that it's hard to do this alone, and that, again, tapping into others that are a lot more savvy about this can be really helpful. And you don't have to do it. I worked with a team for about 3 months, but sometimes you can just work with them for 1 month. There's many different ways to do this.
Well, so you had a publicity team based in the US, but didn't you also have a social media, or did somebody else who was specializing in the digital side of things?
Yes, and again, this is my other tip, which is many times we can't do these things alone. And again, I will just say I was quite busy, and it was hard for me sometimes to just think about how to maintain my website, how to get my newsletter out on a regular basis, to do all of the things that needed to happen. And so early on, I tapped into, one of my nannies who was a young person that was a lot more savvy about using social media to help me with my website and to help me with making sure my newsletter got out on a regular basis. Again, I created the content, but it was someone that then helped me to make sure that that went out. And I would certainly suggest to other authors to tap into folks that can be helpful to them. And again, the younger generation knows a lot more about how to do this than some of us might. So bringing them on, again, all of this was part-time, but it just helped me to ensure that these things happened on an effective way. Over time, I also brought on a friend to help me with some of the marketing in Europe and to help me to reach out to different organizations. And I think that started sometime in January of last year. I just needed another person that I could chat with, made sure that they were making contacts for me. I just didn't have the bandwidth to do it all on my own. And I think one of the questions people always ask is, well, this must be really expensive. And I think the short answer is if you're creative, I always kind of think about the barter technique. Like if you can give me these services, I'll certainly be there for all of your pediatric needs. I'll give your name out to anyone else and make sure that they also use you. So as much as you can be creative sometimes in this world, I think can be very helpful. It's just tapping back into that network. There's always someone that's doing PR and communications that's probably there that can support you.
No, that's a good point. The bartering, I'm all for that. So do you have somebody helping you now to do the social media, to do tweets and Instagram posts and Facebook posts and LinkedIn posts, or are you doing that yourself?
I'll just, again, reiterate that the book writing process doesn't end and that it's really important to have an active presence in social media. As a physician, a lot of this was not something that was authentic for me, and I had to get over a lot of my own feelings about having to put my name out there and to market myself. Again, as a pediatrician, we usually don't do that. We have the hospital tell others who we are. Patients come to us because of our reputation, not because we were marketing ourselves. So I will just say that a lot of this also took some time for me to kind of get over that hump of the importance of having to promote myself. It wasn't a natural process. So you've asked, who's helped me now. I've had folks over the last year that have helped me with some of this, but I'm the one that's at the end of the day still driving that content. I think that I need to continue this. I probably will get another young person to help me just to keep thinking about Instagram and some of the other things that, again, I don't think of or do regularly. I still have one person that's maintaining my website and helping me get my newsletter out.
Excellent. So what proportion of your time your work time, do you think you spend on marketing the book now?
Well, it's taken up a lot more of my time currently, but I also decided that this was my time to get the book out. So I do spend several hours a week right now with virtual launches, with interviews. I still probably have an interview or a podcast or something like this nearly every single day. And I am giving myself to the end of this month to really kind of close that down because I'm shifting into hospital work very soon. I probably won't have the time to do this. But I do think that I will have to continue to keep my newsletter going, my Instagram posts, and all of that. I'm going to probably need to get some support to make sure that that happens.
So how often does your newsletter come out?
My newsletter is once a month, and my Instagram posts probably every couple of days. I also use LinkedIn, which I think is a wonderful way to get word out in a very professional way. And I would again encourage folks to think about a variety of social media. LinkedIn, the content is very different sometimes and the audience is different than who you have on Instagram, which is much more about images and pictures. It's flashy. People don't check it more than after 24 hours. And then I have a group that are still very loyal to Facebook. So I sometimes will also post things on my professional Facebook account. So again, you can see there's a lot of different things that are out there. I've been told to use Pinterest. I feel like, I've kind of drawn the line. I can't take on another form of media. I've also been told to use Twitter. It just wasn't something that I could keep up with. So I think you need to use your media formats to make sure that, at least initially, that you're using it quite actively to get word out, and you're cultivating this group that wants to hear your messaging if you want to continue to use that platform for other things.
So I guess that whenever you've been doing your virtual talks and everything else, you've been picking people up who've then ended up subscribing to your newsletter.
Yes, I do tell them that if you're interested and you want more information about teenagers, please subscribe to to my newsletter, come back to my website, follow me on Instagram. And again, you'll have some folks that will. You'll have some folks that will buy your book. You'll have others that just kind of join and think it's great, and that's it. So I do think you just keep putting the word out about the information you provide, and you certainly will get some folks that will be part of that larger community.
Yes, I can imagine. I can imagine it's all a knock-on effect, and it never ever stops. So, one thing that people say is fundamental to all this is getting reviews on Amazon. Now, I know, and you will know now, that a review that goes on Amazon.com doesn't go on Amazon.co.uk, and you end up having to work quite hard getting reviews in lots of places. And it was interesting because I went on Amazon today to see where your book was in the bestseller lists, and I noticed that it's in different bestseller lists in .co.uk from the ones that it is in Amazon.com. How have you been working with Amazon? What have you done there? I noticed you've got a profile page there, but what are you doing there?
There's a whole kind of science to Amazon, and I think it's just very important for authors to realize if they truly want to use that, and again, over time, be able to say that you're an Amazon bestseller, or to get your book out through Amazon, that you need to be knowledgeable about that, or have others that can help you to navigate that. There are different categories that you can be part of, and sometimes those categories can depend in different countries. Because my book was a book that went out to an international audience, I not only had Amazon US and UK, but I also have Amazon in the Netherlands and in Germany, and I believe there's one in India. So it just makes things more complicated. But on top of that, I also now have the book going out to multiple other bookstores, including most recently to Walmart. And that just happened. I don't even know how that occurred, but it's actually quite good because that's a place that a lot of Americans sometimes will go to and pick up a book. So my short answer on it when it comes to reviews is that it's really important to encourage people that have read your book, particularly those that are in your focus group that really understand your book, to get out there and to write a review. But I can also say it's probably one of the most challenging things to get people to do. And I've been told to get a lot more reviews on all of these different platforms. And at the end of the day, you only have so much time, and you don't also want to keep reminding your friends over and over and over again to write that review. But I will just, again, mention that this is an important part of getting the book out to a broader audience, and ensuring that it kind of stays out there for longer.
Yes, I know, and I know it's ongoing, but it is very important. So I urge any of you who are listening to this who have the book to go and do a review, because it will really help. So in all of this process, you've said that deadlines are really important, and that working with the focus groups has been incredibly helpful. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with people who want to write a book and then promote it effectively?
Well, I have to say that my husband has been a very important part of this process, and certainly my kids also were a focus group. I think my husband Huntfried read everything that I've written, was kind of by my side as my critic, and so having a supportive family, I think, sometimes can be really important, particularly when you're pulling out of all these other responsibilities as you're trying to get deadlines in. My own boys, by the way, also read and were really helpful with my illustrations, which we haven't talked about at all.
No.
But also having good illustrations can be really important. I worked with Kath Brew, who's a fabulous illustrator, but having someone that is a good fit and that can convey those images and translate them into ways that help your book to come alive are really important, but they take time. So I would just mention that's really useful. Other things that have helped me, I think it's not giving up, it's believing in yourself, it's persistence. And someone very recently said, I'm an introvert, this doesn't come naturally to me. And I'll just say that, again, you need to come back to the fact, why am I writing this book? Why is it that I want to get this word out there? And who can I tap into if I'm naturally not someone that can speak to all of these audiences that will allow me to make sure that message gets out? I think that's probably the biggest thing.
Yes. Thank you very much for that. So we've reached the end of my questions, but I'd just like you to finish before we open to the floor for questions. How do people find you online? What are all your URLs and your handles and all the rest of that?
Well, I have a website, which is dranishaAbraham.com. I can be found on Instagram, and that's Dr. written out, Dr. and then underscore Anisha. And if you want to join my monthly newsletter, which is Global Teens, you can go to my website, and there's a link for that. And I also have a professional Facebook site, which is called Dr. Anisha as well. So there are different ways to find me. And I hope that people think about buying the book as a result of this discussion if they haven't already. And as mentioned, it's available in many different places. But if you go to my website, you can see how to best find it in your own country.
It is a fantastic book. I learned so much from working with you on it, Anisha. The trouble is my kids were in their 20s by the time I read it, and my God, I wish I'd read it earlier. I really wish I'd read it when they were about 10. There was so much useful advice in there. You talk about so many things, from ADHD to self-harming to anxiety to bullying, to so many aspects of being a parent that a parent can face. And so it really is an incredibly comprehensive read, and you are such an authority, of course, on the subject, so thank you very much. So let's have a look and see if we've got any questions so far here. Some people have been asking things. Let's just see, did anybody ask a question so far?
What was the average of attendees to each Zoom launch? Is that correct? Was one of the questions, I think.
Oh yes, I've got that one. Yes, that's a good question. Absolutely.
We are a small group. Maybe folks can also unmute themselves, Joe, and ask their question if that's allowed.
If you would like to unmute yourself to ask the question, you are very welcome, but let's see who you are, because this will go on YouTube. So keep your video off, but you're very welcome to ask or type.
I think it really has varied depending on the community. I've had groups as large as 200 or so. Recently, I did a talk through a group called Little Steps Asia, and Bookazine, which is the largest English bookseller in Hong Kong. And that went out to about 200 with a live chat. It was also on Instagram and several other media platforms. So it can vary. I've also had some very intimate, quote unquote, fireside chats with maybe 20, 30 folks. And sometimes it's nice just to have a smaller group so that everyone can just get in there and chat and talk. Probably one of my more unusual ones was to a group called Brown Papas Unite. And it was a group of fathers that were really interested in talking about the topic. And it was actually a lot of fun to just have just a whole male audience listening to this. I've also had some professional news anchors be the moderators for my discussion, particularly for one of my Washington, D.C. launches. I've certainly had more than one moderator, so they can go back and forth. So there's lots of different ways to do it.
Thank you. Danau's asked a question. How do you use LinkedIn? It's also your professional profile as a pediatrician. So what do you do? Do you add anybody who adds you? Oh, I don't do that. So what do you do with LinkedIn?
Well, I think LinkedIn is really wonderful in terms of getting you to a much broader network. I've been using LinkedIn probably for the last couple of years, initially just to post articles that were relevant to teen health, over time to post some of my blogs. So I think that if you have information that's relevant, sometimes it's just reposting things that are important to you. I very recently saw an article about how to do a good Zoom interview, and someone had reposted that. And of course, there's a lot now about COVID and vaccines and whatever else. So sometimes just using that as a platform to get information out is a good way to connect. And I do try to be responsive to people that have asked to connect me. I try not to do it to complete strangers unless I feel that there's a connection, but I do try to be open to people that want to connect because we have some contact. And recently I've used LinkedIn as a way to tell people about events I'm having. I just had an event, for example, a virtual event in India. So I reached out to the LinkedIn community that was in Asia to tell them about this event. So you can start telling folks, things that you're doing that might be specific as a result.
Do you always link to a purchase page for your book when you do a post on LinkedIn?
No, I have to say that I've been much more focused on getting content out with my Instagram posts, my LinkedIn posts. It's much more specific to, what are some tips to help kids thrive? How do we get young people to have more effective communication with parents? So it's more based on content. And then maybe every couple of posts, I will also mention, I'm the author of Raising Global Teens or in my book. But I think that if you're constantly out there just giving a link for your book and only promoting your book, it turns people off. And like I said, for me, my mission was really more about getting information out. And of course, the book is a vehicle. So I think you need to be very thoughtful about it. In my LinkedIn profile, it does say that I'm an author of this book. So if anyone does go to my profile or sees that, they'll see again that I'm the author and also my website. But I think, again, you have to be very thoughtful about just constantly promoting the book alone.
Thank you very much. That's a very good point. Amel has asked, what did you do to figure out where all the places were that you could do your Zoom talks and interviews? Did you proactively reach out to them to speak for those platforms, or I suppose, or did they contact you?
Yeah, that's a good question. As I mentioned, I had been speaking and being a consultant in communities for some time, particularly in Hong Kong and the Netherlands, US, and other places in Europe. So I went back to those communities and said, look, now I'm going to be talking about some of the important themes in my book, and I can make that personal to your community and some of the questions that you have in your community. How can we do a launch and draw into that larger network? So I tapped into places that I have already spoken at. I will also say, again, the Families and Global Transition Network has been incredibly helpful to me, because through that, I think, there have been a number of podcasts, a number of interviews. I know that they have continued to refer me to other folks in the network that maybe didn't know my work, to say, you should talk to this expert. And so I think there's some really neat things that have come out of, again, tapping into the network and having people know what I'm doing.
Thank you. Thank you. Does anybody else have any more questions they'd like to ask? Not, oh, sorry. Some people have got to go. How did you find your voice, says Danao. Oh, yes, good one.
Well, I'm just going to say that my writing group, and of course, this writing process, and then of course, working with you over time, was really instrumental in finding my voice. And the biggest advice that I got was, how do you translate what you're speaking to your patients right now on? How do you translate that? And how do you come across as being kind of warm, but at the same time professional and authoritative? And it takes some time to figure out what it is you want to do. I also went through an exercise with the writing group in terms of finding out who was my audience, and coming up with maybe 2 or 3 characters that would be my audience and how I would write to them. But I think at the end of the day, my real audience, as I mentioned, were my girlfriends that I have conversations with. And for me, this book was really just an extension of those conversations, and how I can make it really just to the point, very practical, and good for someone that had a very short attention span. So I think it takes time. Those blogs, the focus groups were really helpful in honing in onto what was my authentic voice.
Yes, thank you. It can be very hard to find your voice. It can be very hard to trust what other people might think is your voice. One thing that I might suggest somebody did would be to talk to their girlfriend or whoever their ideal reader is, and then record it and then transcribe it. You can transcribe things with otter.ai, which I'll write in the chat in a minute. And although it will be terrible because we say and we use far more words than we really need, you get an idea of what your flow and what your natural rhythm is and what sort of words you use. So because there are certain people who always say, I see what you mean, and others who say, I hear what you're saying, and others who say, yes, I have a sense, I understand that. So people are audio or video or kinesthetic, and you start to notice what you are. And the other thing that I find very helpful for getting people to find their writer's voice is to do a lot of speed writing, where you just put the pen on the paper and go for 10 minutes. And sometimes it can be quite surprising. I find that to be very freeing. We use that in my writers' circles a lot. And over time, people's voices really do emerge. And I have found that, that it probably takes a good 6 months to 9 months for people to relax enough for their voice to emerge, but I don't know that it happens immediately. I think you need time. But thank you for your tips too. I think that's very good to notice how it is you are speaking to the people who are your ideal readers. So thank you very much for that. I'm not sure if we're going to have any more questions. We usually finish on the top of the hour, which is in 2 minutes anyway. So if anybody else is going to ask a question, please speak now. But otherwise, I shall thank Anisha very, very much indeed.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you all of you that have joined today. I love your questions. I love your support. You know, as I mentioned, this is really not a process that I've done alone. It's because of a wonderful team of my family and others, and certainly of working with Summertime and with Joe that have really allowed me to have this book come to fruition. So I'm very grateful, and I certainly hope that others can be inspired a little bit by this process, that it isn't as daunting as it seems, but just taking your time, being thoughtful about it, getting the support you need early on can really help you to write that book.
Thank you, Anisha. Monty has just said, can I ask her, get you to answer her question about PR? I don't actually understand what her question is. So Monty, could you ask it again, please? Because I'm afraid I don't really understand what it is you want me to ask. Why not? That's a marvelous idea.
It was a comment, but I'm interested to hear if there is any comment on my comment, basically. So after I launched my book, I did hire a PR agency for 3 months, and you know, the objective was to pitch to TV and written media. And most of the pitches came back saying that because the book was published privately and not through a big publishing house, that it was not possible to like make a report about it or interview me or anything. So I just wanted to know if Anisha also found that barrier towards PR.
That's a very good question. And I did get that comment, for example, when I was approaching the New York Times, that the New York Times does not review books that are not published by major publishing houses in the United States. If you're using a smaller publishing firm, that could be used against you. I will also say that in general, I was writing this book right during the elections, or I released the book right before the election in the United States. So there's always going to be something that also affects your media and getting it out to the larger audience. And in my case, it was much harder to get into print media than it was to get into TV and radio. And I learned later that TV and radio needs content right away. So I would literally sometimes get a call like 24 hours beforehand, can you go live on ABC affiliate? Can you go live on this? Because they just need content. And again, the pitch and what I was talking about was very topical to what was occurring. So I just want to say that, again, in response to your question, the publishing house could sometimes be a deterrent for some groups, but for other groups that, again, are ones that need information right away, if you have the right pitch and it's aligned to what's going on at the time, you could actually end up being able to be interviewed very quickly.
That's a very good point. So if you want to say, I want to write about keeping teens anxiety-free during lockdown and Zoom schooling, and by the way, I have also written a book, that is very different from, please will you write about my book, or would you interview me about my book? So you put yourself across as an expert on an issue, and the fact that you are an author actually just lends authority to what it is you're going to say. So I hope that's helpful. Sorry, Anisha, what were you going to say?
No, I was just going to add to that, which is probably the most successful pitch that I had was that the month of September was Suicide Awareness Month in the United States. And so I was interviewed multiple times about the increase in anxiety and depression and suicide. And then, of course, they would say, and this is Anisha Abraham, the author of Raising Global Teens. If you want more information about stress or anxiety, you know, here's the book. And they actually showed the book on headline news because of that pitch, because of suicide awareness. So most of my pitches came through not because I was talking about the book, and about, you know, the wonderful things that happen to cross-cultural kids, it was because of, again, a very specific pitch that had to do with something that was happening at the time. Again, this is to the mainstream networks and media. My podcasts, my interviews, you know, to other groups was because of the book. So I think you just need to know the audience and to realize that, again, the book may not be as exciting to the larger networks in the same way.
Thank you. I think that's a very good question that I'm glad you re-asked it, Monty, because I don't actually think I could see it there in the chat list, because I think that's a very, very important point. It makes a big difference how you do pitch yourself to the media. And then Dano has asked, how long do you think you can do book launches for after a book is published? I would say that a year probably is the max. That would probably be the cutoff. I don't know, are you finding that it's more difficult for you now, Anisha? We're just, what are we, 8 weeks in?
Yes, it came out in October. You know, someone did tell me that you're going to be tired of talking about your book at some point. I'm like, that will never happen. You know, I can keep talking about it, but you do at some point kind of get to the point where you're like, okay, I need to move on to something else. I think that if someone truly asked me and they wanted me to do a book launch and it was a community that I felt was of need or, you know, an important group, I would say yes. But I think at some point you then also decide, you know, this is where I want to put my time and energy. But I would agree that I'm still open to it for probably the next several months. And then at some point you want to move to other things. I'll also add, Joe, we've talked about this, but now there's a short film idea that's coming out of my book. And one of the little stories about my family meeting Neil Armstrong has now been written to a script and is becoming a movie project. So I guess there's other things that sometimes come out of your book that you never even realized. And that's something that hopefully will happen in the next year or two.
Now that is amazing, and that doesn't happen to everybody. But I wish you lots of luck with that. And thank you so much again, Anisha. Thank you everybody for your questions. This will be available on YouTube. It will be available on my Joe Parfitt website. The transcription app, yes, I put that up there, Dana, otter.ai. I put it a short while ago. Okay, did you see that? So I will now end the meeting. If anybody wants a transcription of the chat, email me and I'll be able to get it to you. But until then, thank you, Anisha. I wish you a very good day and I wish you a very good session with Doreen tomorrow.
Thank you, all of you, Karen, Atu, Amal, Danu, for joining and being on for so long. Appreciate your support. And Joe, thank you again. This was really lovely.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you.